fundamental assumptions many of us hold about human diversity. We're going to ask you to maybe rethink one of the most historically charged and frankly profoundly misunderstood concepts out there, the idea of race.
Yeah, it's still a loaded term, isn't it? It just vibrates with complexity, sensitivity, and just immense historical baggage. It's shaped entire societies. It's influenced laws. It's deeply impacted individual lives for, well, centuries.
Absolutely. So our mission today isn't just to, define race. We want to take you on a journey, really, through time and through science to unpack how our understanding of this whole concept has dramatically evolved. We're going to pull in insights from some key historical texts, cutting-edge modern science genetics, especially, and also anthropological perspectives.
Exactly. We want to clarify what race is, what it definitely isn't, and maybe most importantly, how its definition, or often, its misdefinition, has profoundly shaped the world we live in and everyone's experiences within it.
And this isn't just, an academic thing.
Not at all. Our goal here is to give you, the listener, a real shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on what is, let's face it, a critical topic. We're hoping for some aha moments, maybe some surprising facts that help reframe things, but without, drowning you in jargon or just overwhelming you with data.
Right. We want to make complex ideas clear, relatable, and ultimately maybe offer a kind of path away from some old prejudices, some outdated ideas, towards new understandings.
Understandings rooted, really, in our shared humanity and, crucially, in the most current scientific truths.
Okay, so let's dive in. Where should we begin? I think we need to start in a very specific historical place. 1871.
Ah, yes. The year Darwin published The Descent of Man.
Exactly. And when we look back at this really important text, it's absolutely crucial, isn't it, to understand the world Darwin was living in, the intellectual landscape.
Totally. He, like pretty much every major thinker of his time, used the term race in a way that's just dramatically different from how we'd understand it today, scientifically or socially.
The Victorian-era, right? It was such a fascinating, kind of contradictory time.
It really was. Huge intellectual energy, this growing interest in anthropology, natural history. But, and this is key, they were working with extremely limited actual data, especially on human genetics, which didn't really exist then.
And it was also a time deeply steeped in certain biases, particularly Eurocentric ones, that must have colored how they saw things.
No, inevitably. It could not color their observations, their interpretations.
Yeah.
You just can't separate Darwin's work, or anyone's from that era, from its context.
So he was, like you said, a man of his time. His observations were filtered through the scientific ideas and the social norms of the mid-19th century.
Precisely. Anthropology was really just getting started. Its methods were, well, pretty basic. They relied a lot on just looking at people, superficial visual stuff, comparative anatomy.
Like measuring skulls.
Exactly. Measuring skulls, facial angles, body proportions. They genuinely believed these physical differences pointed to deep, fundamental biological divisions. It seems strange now, but that was the cutting edge then.
So the lens he was using was, by our standards today, pretty limited and biased.
Definitely limited. And yes, often biased by the social hierarchies that were just accepted as normal in his own society.
Okay, so given that context, what were the specific things he actually said about human diversity in The Descent of Man? Because these ideas, they really stuck around and caused problems later, didn't they?
They really did. He focused mainly on what he could easily see, right? Superficial physical traits. He talked about skin color, hair texture, facial features, seeing these as the main signs of different human groups. He observed these differences, documented them across different populations.
But he didn't have the tools to look deeper, genetically.
Exactly. He lacked the science, the concepts, really, to see if these surface differences actually mapped onto distinct biological categories, like, different subspecies. It was all observation from the outside, a kind of taxonomy. And we now know that approach just doesn't provide any real biological support for the groupings he was suggesting.
But then he went further, didn't he? He didn't just stop at physical descriptions. He started speculating about, what was it, intellectual and moral endowments?
Yes, and that's where it gets really, really problematic, and where his science got tangled up with the prejudices of the time.
How so?
Well, unfortunately, Darwin did speculate that these groups, these races he perceived, also differed in their inherent intellectual and moral endowments. And crucially, this wasn't based on any real evidence. It was, frankly, soaked in the Eurocentric biases and the sort of colonial mindset of the era.
So basically, Europeans came out on top in his view.
Implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, yes. They were often positioned at the top of this perceived human hierarchy. It wasn't a scientific finding from data, it was really a reflection of the existing social order, the prejudices of Victorian England, sort of projected onto his biological framework.
Wow. It's a stark reminder of how societal beliefs can really warp scientific interpretation, even for someone like Darwin.
It really is. Even the most brilliant minds aren't immune to the biases of their time.
And he also tried to explain why these differences might exist. He connected them to the environment, didn't he? Like climate and isolation.
Yes, he did. He hypothesized that things like geographic isolation and climate were key drivers in shaping these perceived racial differences over long stretches of time. So maybe certain climates led to certain skin tones or hair textures or even skull shapes as populations adapted locally.
Which, I mean, environment does influence adaptations, right? We know that now.
Absolutely, we see that clearly. Skin color adapting to UV radiation is a prime example. But Darwin took a big leap. He connected these environmental factors not just to superficial traits, but to the creation of fixed, distinct races that also had these varied intellectual and moral capacities built in.
So he imagined these distinct categories of humans set on different paths.
Kind of. He imagined these environmental pressures creating separate, almost commutable types of humans, each on its own trajectory, diverging significantly.
And he even hinted, didn't he, that some races might be on completely separate evolutionary paths, almost like different branches of humanity.
Precisely. And that was another really concerning speculation with pretty dire consequences down the line. The idea that some races might be evolving differently was incredibly dangerous. It implied this inherent long-term divergence that could easily be used to justify hierarchies, ideas of natural superiority.
An idea that modern science has completely overturned, thankfully.
Completely debunked. Modern science points to a single, unified evolutionary story for all of humanity.
Okay, so looking back at Darwin's views on race, what's the main thing we need to remember today? How do we place them?
I think the crucial takeaway is that his views were a direct product of the anthropology of his day, which was really in its infancy. It was a mix of, yes, groundbreaking observation for the time, but severely limited by a real lack of solid data, especially genetic data, which just wasn't there.
And heavily influenced by the biases of the time.
And deeply colored by these significant Eurocentric biases that were just part of the air people breathed in Victorian society. He was working with the best tools he had, but those tools were by today's standards flawed, insufficient, and very easy to misinterpret.
And understanding that context helps us see how those initial ideas, even if just observations or speculations, got twisted later into something much worse.
Yeah, exactly. It sets the stage for understanding the really dangerous legacy, how these early thoughts were exploited to fuel systemic racism.
Right, which leads us straight into that. The misuse of Darwin's ideas to fuel what became known as scientific racism. It's a really chilling part of history.
It is. His immense scientific prestige, perhaps unintentionally, gave this powerful weight, this almost unchallengeable authority, to people who wanted to formalize and institutionalize racist ideologies. This happened throughout the late 19th and well into the 20th century.
So even his sort of offhand remarks, as you put it, or tentative ideas, were seized upon.
Absolutely. For those looking for a justification for existing power structures, for prejudice, for discrimination, Darwin's words became like gold. They were twisted into foundational justifications for really widespread harm.
It's a sobering reminder, isn't it, about the responsibility that comes with scientific authority.
It really is. Regardless of what Darwin personally intended, his words were picked up, selectively interpreted, cherry-picked even, by people looking for scientific cover for their prejudices. They used his authority to make discrimination seem legitimate, natural, even scientifically mandated on a huge scale.
Can you give us some specific examples? How did this actually play out on the ground, in schools, for instance?
Oh, education was a key area. One of the most insidious ways this spread was through educational indoctrination. These ideas of racial hierarchy were literally baked into school textbooks across Europe and the US. Imagine kids learning from a young age that some groups were inherently smarter or more moral or more evolved than others based on things like skull shape or skin color.
Textbooks actually showed this.
Yes, often with diagrams, so-called evolutionary ladders, with Europeans conveniently at the top, other groups arranged below, or classifications of skulls supposedly proving intellectual differences. This wasn't casual. It was structured curriculum designed to instill these distorted, unscientific ideas.
That's horrifying, cementing prejudice in young minds.
Exactly, shaping worldviews for generations.
And beyond schools, these ideas were used to prop up global power structures, like colonialism.
Precisely. Scientific racism provided this pseudo-intellectual justification for colonial exploitation worldwide. Remember the concept of the civilizing mission, the idea that European powers had a duty to bring enlightenment and progress to supposedly lesser races in Africa, Asia, the Americas.
A convenient narrative.
Very convenient. It painted colonialism as this benevolent act, masking the brutal reality of economic exploitation, political subjugation, resource extraction, and the suppression of indigenous cultures. It basically said, if these people are inherently inferior, then we, the superior race, have a natural right, even a duty, to rule over them.
And maybe the most direct and chilling link is to the eugenics movement. That seems like the endpoint of this kind of thinking.
Yes, the connection is undeniable and deeply tragic. Eugenics was this pseudoscience that became incredibly popular in the early 20th century, aiming to improve the human race through selective breeding. The logic, warped as it was, went. If some races or traits are superior and others inferior, then we should encourage the good ones to reproduce and discourage, or even prevent the bad ones.
Which led to horrific policies.
It absolutely did. Forced sterilizations of people deemed unfit, often targeting people of color, the poor, people with disabilities, restrictive immigration laws based on racial purity, and ultimately, it fed into the ideologies behind atrocities like the Holocaust, with its horrific concept of racial hygiene leading to genocide.
A terrifying trajectory from misused scientific ideas to systematic human rights abuses.
A direct and terrifying line.
But it's also really important to stress, isn't it, that these ideas weren't just accepted by everyone. Even back in Darwin's time, there were people pushing back.
Absolutely crucial point, and often overlooked. Even as scientific racism was gaining steam, there were powerful counter-arguments. Abolitionists, for example, fiercely rejected any notion of inherent racial inferiority. They argued on moral, ethical, and increasingly on empirical grounds that human worth and dignity couldn't be measured by skull size or skin color.
People like Frederick Douglass.
Exactly. Figures like Douglass directly challenged the scientific racism of their day, powerfully asserting the full humanity and intellectual capacity of Black people. They knew human value was inherent, not based on these arbitrary categories. So, resistance and critical thinking were there from the start. These ideas never had a free pass.
Okay, so despite those criticisms, the main point remains. Darwin's scientific authority, even unintentionally, was effectively weaponized. It was repurposed to make prejudice seem legitimate, leading to discriminatory practices on a massive scale.
That's the core of it. The authority of science, which people often see as objective and neutral, was hijacked. This didn't just give a respectable gloss to harmful ideas, it gave them incredible momentum. It allowed them to get embedded in laws, in schools, in the very structure of society.
Creating this legacy of inequality and injustice that we're honestly still dealing with today.
A legacy that has endured for generations. It shows how powerful narratives, especially when wrapped in the cloak of science, can be incredibly destructive.
Okay, but here's where the story takes a dramatic turn, right? Because science itself evolved. Modern genetics, especially in the last few decades, has completely revolutionized our understanding.
It really has. It's fundamentally, decisively dismantled the biological basis for race as these distinct, inherent categories. It's not just an update, it's a complete paradigm shift in how we view ourselves as a species.
What genetics has shown us, it just completely rewrites the rule book on human variation.
Totally. The old classifications, those rigid boxes based on appearance, they just crumble under genetic scrutiny. The evidence points towards deep interconnectedness, not fundamental division.
And one of the most mind-blowing findings, the one that really flips the old ideas, is that human genetic variation is continuous. What does that actually mean? It sounds kind of counterintuitive.
It does feel paradoxical, doesn't it? But it's a profound truth. The key finding, and this is often the real aha moment, is that the greatest genetic diversity among humans exists within African populations, not between the so-called races.
Wait, say that again? The most diversity is within Africa.
Exactly. Think about it. If races were truly distinct biological groups, like subspecies, you'd expect the biggest genetic differences to be between them. Between, say, Europeans and Asians, or Asians and Africans. But that's not what we find. The genetic landscape within the continent of Africa is incredibly rich and varied, far more varied than the differences you find between an average person from Europe and an average person from East Asia.
Why is that?
Because modern humans originated in Africa. As small groups migrated out over tens of thousands of years, they took only a subset of that original genetic diversity with them. So the root population in Africa retains the most ancient, the most varied genetic makeup.
So this fact alone just destroys the idea of distinct racial groups.
It fundamentally challenges it, yes. Because the variation inside some of these broad geographic populations, especially African ones, is far greater than the average variation between these socially defined racial groups.
So there aren't separate genetic blueprints for each race.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But geneticists actually sees the allele frequencies. It's just how common a particular version of a gene is. These frequencies shift gradually across geography, like smooth gradients.
Can you give an analogy?
Sure. Imagine walking across a huge landscape. You move from a forest to grassland to desert. The environment changes, but gradually, right? There's no sharp line where forest stops and grassland begins. It blends.
Okay, I get that.
Human genetic variation is like that, a continuous, unbroken gradient across the globe. There are no sharp genetic cliffs or boundaries, which makes it biologically impossible to draw clear, objective lines between races. Those lines just don't exist in our DNA.
That makes so much sense when you put it like that. And what about our shared ancestry? Genetics has really nailed that down too, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This is another huge pillar of our modern understanding. All humans alive today, every single one of us, trace our ancestry back to small groups living in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago. This isn't just a guess. It's backed by overwhelming genetic evidence from mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosomes, entire genomes.
So we all share this deep heritage.
A profound shared heritage. We literally all come from the same place, relatively recently in evolutionary time. It makes our visible differences look pretty superficial in the grand scheme of things.
And since people started migrating out of Africa, it wasn't like they stayed in neat little boxes, right? People mixed.
Constantly. For tens of thousands of years, there's been massive gene flow intermingling across human populations. People moved, explored, traded, had families with people from different regions. The idea of pure racial lines is a complete myth. This constant genetic mixing further blurs any arbitrary line someone might try to draw.
So the whole concept of race as a fixed biological thing just doesn't fit the reality of our shared history and constant mixing.
It completely fails to capture it. It's an outdated framework that just doesn't reflect the biological reality of our species.
Okay, so if it's not race in the biological sense that explains things like skin color differences, what is it? Why do we see these variations?
Adaptations. That's the key concept. Traits like skin pigmentation are classic examples of direct adaptations to environmental pressures, specifically UV radiation from the sun.
Right, darker skin near the equator for protection, lighter skin further away to help make vitamin D.
Exactly. Populations near the equator evolve darker skin to protect against intense UV damage, skin cancer, folate depletion. Populations at higher latitudes with less UV evolve lighter skin to maximize vitamin D production, crucial for bone health where sunlight is limited.
So these aren't markers of some fundamental racial type?
Not at all. They're local, geographically specific adaptations. Natural selection shaping populations to survive and thrive in their particular environments over thousands of years. They're about survival, not about belonging to some distinct racial cluster.
Can you give another example or two, something other than skin color?
Sure, how about lactase persistence? The ability to digest milk into adulthood.
Most people can't, right? After childhood.
Globally, most can't. Like other mammals, humans usually stop producing the enzyme lactase after weaning. But in populations with a long history of dairy farming parts of Europe, Africa, the Middle East, many people can digest milk as adults. This isn't a racial trait. It's a beneficial adaptation that arose independently in different groups who relied heavily on milk as a food source. It gave them a survival advantage.
Okay, that's a great example. Any others?
High-altitude adaptations are fascinating. Think about people living in the Himalayas, like Tibetans, or the Andes, or the Ethiopian highlands. Over millennia, groups like the Tibetans have evolved unique physiological traits, like using oxygen more efficiently, having wider blood vessels that let them thrive in thin air, where people from sea level would really struggle. Again, specific adaptations to extreme environments.
So the takeaway is these visible differences aren't signs of deep inherent racial divides like the old thinkers believe. They're about adapting to specific places.
Precisely. They show our species remarkable adaptability. They're a patchwork of local solutions to environmental challenges, driven by natural selection, not evidence of separate biological races. And crucially, these adaptations involve only a tiny fraction of our overall genome, which is overwhelmingly similar across all human populations. They're literally skin deep.
Which brings us to a really important shift in how scientists talk about this. They've mostly stopped using race in a biological context and use population instead. Why is that distinction so important?
It's hugely important. The scientific community moved away from race because, well, first, it lacks biological validity, as we've discussed. Second, it's imprecise. And third, given its terrible history of misuse, it's ethically loaded and harmful. Population is a much more accurate and neutral term for scientists. It lets them study human genetic variation, trace ancestry, investigate adaptations without imposing those old, arbitrary hierarchical classifications.
So what does population mean in this context?
It usually refers to groups who share a relatively recent common ancestry, or live near each other geographically, or share specific genetic markers due to history, migration, or isolation. It acknowledges genetic patterns without resorting to the misleading baggage of race. It allows for rigorous science without reinforcing dangerous social myths.
Okay, so we've really established that biologically, race as these distinct fixed categories just doesn't hold water. It's not a biological reality. But, and this is a huge but, just because it's not biological doesn't mean it isn't incredibly painfully real in its social effects.
This is the absolute crucial distinction to grasp. No biological basis, yes, but undeniably real in its social, economic, political consequences.
So how do we understand that? If it's not biological, what is it?
It's a social construct. Racial categories aren't natural groupings found in nature. They're human-made categories, constantly shifting, constantly being redefined, that emerge from specific historical moments, political needs, economic forces. Societies create and enforce these categories, usually, frankly, to justify power imbalances and maintain hierarchies.
Can you talk more about those historical forces? What actually created the need for these categories?
Well, think about huge historical events that shaped our world. The transatlantic slave trade is a primary example. Starting in the 1500s, millions of Africans forcibly brought to the Americas. How do you possibly justify enslaving another human being? Treating them as property. You create a story, a construct, that dehumanizes them, portrays them as fundamentally different, inferior. Racial categories were literally fabricated to justify that horrific economic system.
And colonialism, too.
Absolutely. European powers carving up the globe needed a reason why they, a small minority, had the right to rule over and exploit vast populations and resources. Racial hierarchies gave them that pseudo-scientific justification. And later, things like Jim Crow laws in the American South after slavery ended. They needed rigid racial definitions to enforce segregation and maintain white supremacy. These systems of oppression required the concept of race to function and seem legitimate.
And once created, these categories weren't just ideas floating around. They got built into the system, right? Into institutions.
Exactly. Woven right into the fabric of society. Laws, policies, everyday life. Think about legal systems defining who is black or white, sometimes with absurd rules like the one-drop rule, where any known African ancestry made you black legally, stripping away rights.
Education systems.
Rigidly segregated. Separate and profoundly unequal schools, locking in different life chances, housing policies like redlining, deliberately denying mortgages and services in minority neighborhoods, creating lasting wealth and health gaps. These weren't accidents. They were institutionalized practices designed to maintain that racial hierarchy. The effects are still profoundly felt today.
And all of that obviously shapes individual lives in very real ways, not just abstract systems.
Deeply personal ways. Systemic discrimination in jobs, housing, the justice system. And think about health disparities, not because of biology, we know that's a myth, but because of social factors. Unequal access to healthcare, living in more polluted areas due to segregation, environmental racism, the chronic stress of dealing with prejudice. These things have real, measurable health impacts. Certain conditions might be more common in some groups, but it traces back to these social and economic factors, not innate biology.
And identity itself, how people see themselves and are seen by others.
Hugely shaped by it. How you understand yourself, form community, navigate the world, often defined within or against these imposed racial categories. It impacts self-perception, social interactions, life opportunities, everything.
So how do anthropologists study this, given it's social, not biological?
Anthropologists are really key here. They study the historical origins of these constructs, yes, but also how people today actively navigate, resist, and even redefine race in their everyday lives. How do communities cope, challenge these categories, sometimes reclaim terms that were insults and turn them into sources of pride? It's about understanding the lived experience, the human agency involved. People aren't just passive victims of classification. They actively shape its meaning, even under oppression. So understanding race as a social construct is vital. Why? What does this knowledge allow us to do?
It's crucial for dismantling the myths that fuel prejudice and inequality. If we really get that these categories aren't natural biological truths, but artificial constructs created for power, then we can challenge their power and undo their effects. It lets us address the real roots of discrimination, which are social, systemic, historical, not biological. It shifts the whole conversation. If something was constructed by society, it can be deconstructed. We can build something more just. Okay, so as we start to wrap this up, let's maybe turn towards a more hopeful note. It feels like science, even though it was misused in the past, now actually holds the potential to correct those errors, debunk the myths, and maybe even help foster unity and empathy.
I think that's exactly right. The same scientific tools that helped us take apart the biological idea of race can now be used to build a better future. Science has this amazing capacity for self-correction, for seeking truth, and we're seeing that happen here.
So what are some concrete ways forward? How do we use this knowledge for good?
Well, one huge thing is just widespread, accurate public education about human genetic diversity. When people really understand that variation is continuous, that the deepest diversity is within Africa, that we share this single origin, it makes it much harder to hold on to those false biological ideas about race. Imagine if that understanding was just common knowledge. Getting that information out there in schools, through media, is incredibly powerful for reducing racism, replacing myths with facts.
And what about within science itself? How does the scientific community ensure it doesn't repeat past mistakes?
Inclusive research practices are absolutely essential. That means actively involving diverse communities in genetics research. For too long, studies focus mainly on people of European descent. We need research that benefits all populations, avoids repeating old biases in how data is gathered and interpreted. It means making sure diverse voices are actually part of designing and interpreting the research, making science truly representative and equitable.
You mentioned cultural humility earlier. What does that look like in science?
Cultural humility means science acknowledging its own history, how it was misused, even unintentionally, to support racism. It means committing to strong ethical rules for all research, ensuring accountability, preventing harm. In practice, it might mean, say, when doing genetic research with an indigenous community, that community isn't just a subject. They're partners in designing the study, collecting data, interpreting it, deciding how it's used, who owns it, building trust, making sure science serves, not exploits.
I also find those programs combining genetics with personal history really compelling.
Yes. Pairing genetic ancestry testing with oral histories, family stories, genealogy. That's incredibly powerful. The genetics might show your deep ancestral connections across the globe, highlighting our shared origins and mixing. Then you combine that with personal narratives, community history. It lets people reclaim their own stories, understand their identity in a much richer way than just simplistic racial boxes. It connects the deep past to the living present.
And finally, it sounds like this needs more than just geneticists. It needs collaboration.
Oh, absolutely critical. Geneticists need to work with anthropologists, historians, sociologists, ethicists, even artists and educators. Breaking down those academic silos gives us a much more holistic, nuanced understanding. We see how genes, history, culture, society all interact. It leads to richer insights and helps ensure scientific findings are used wisely and empathetically.
So putting all that together, education, inclusive research, cultural humility, community empowerment, collaboration, what's the ultimate goal? Where could this lead?
I think it helps build what you might call a new science of sisterhood and brotherhood. A science grounded in accurate knowledge, yes, but one that actively promotes human connection over division. It's a vision where understanding our shared origins, the superficiality of our differences, and how divisions were constructed. That understanding becomes a foundation for greater empathy, unity, and recognizing our profound shared humanity.
Wow. What an incredible journey this deep dive has been. We've gone from Darwin's 19th century view, through the misuse of those ideas, to the revolution in modern genetics, and finally integrating the social and anthropological understanding. And the central point seems crystal clear now. Race, as distinct biological categories, is biologically baseless. It's a social construct, one with incredibly real, powerful, and often painful consequences.
Exactly. And the hopeful part is science's ability to self-correct. It's not just about finding facts, but about using that knowledge to guide us towards greater empathy, equity, and more accurate appreciation of our shared human story. It gives us the tools to maybe undo some of the harm.
So, as we leave you today, maybe as you go about your day and notice human differences, our differences, however striking they might seem visually, are really quite superficial. Our unity, genetically and historically, is profoundly deep, and perhaps our shared humanity is the most compelling evidence of all.
Reflect on how this understanding, this shift from old myths to new truths, might reshape your own views on identity, on society, on how interconnected we all truly are.
Mad show, let's go, open up your mind and grow. Facts and stories, things you never know. Every episode, we light the glow. Step into the world of Mad Show. Turn it up, let the rhythm flow. Feel the beat, take control. Don't be shy, just let it go. This is where the magic grows. Tune in now, it's the Mad Show. Lights up bright and minds will glow. Every day we learn and grow. Come along and join the flow. New ideas begin to shine. Breaking limits, crossing lines. Every moment feels divine. In the world of Mad Show time. Turn it up, let the rhythm flow. Feel the beat, take control. Don't be shy, just let it go. This is where the magic grows. Tune in now, it's the Mad Show. Lights are bright and minds will glow. Every day we learn and grow. Come along and join the flow.